Please come on in. On behalf of the Adult Christian Education Committee, I want to welcome you to this class on Born, Raised, Born in Blood. We thought that this would be a very timely subject, and we're going to have a very good teacher teach us, show us some video, and based upon a book by Ken Ham and Charles Ware of that same name. Norm Hargraves, everybody should know, he's been a member of the church for 14 years and is an elder and currently in session, and went to Geneva and got a master's, works at BNY Mellon, has an MDiv from Masters of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He doesn't like to talk about it because he's from there. Let's open with prayer and then Norm will pick up. Thank you, Father, for being here today with us. We ask that you would help us, give us wisdom and understanding on this topic that's so current. And we ask for your guidance as we watch and learn. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Amen.
I'm not sure Bob fully realized what he was saying. I'm looking for the good teacher. I thought that was Jesus, the good teacher. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. Welcome. This is a topic that makes people cringe, I think. Whether you're black or white, doesn't matter. It's a topic that people don't want to touch. It's kind of like the third rail, so to speak. People feel can't talk about politics, can't talk about race, a couple other things, but I guess what makes me an expert in this subject is I grew up as a black man in America. So I guess I have my PhD in this. I've seen a lot of things in this country from a different perspective than most people in this room. And I grew up angry because of that perception. So being treated incorrectly, sometimes inhumanely, for no other reason than just being a man of a darker hue in this country, and you'll know what I'm saying here in a little bit about that. Being followed and stopped by the police, more than one occasion, and that just all fueled everything and made me more and more angry as a young man. Then one day, my favorite show, I was watching it, Law and Order. There was an episode, and the episode centered around, it was titled Out of the Half-Light. It was in season 1, episode 11, and it first aired on 12/11/1990 for any of you who might want to see the episode. But in the episode, it had to do with, for those of you who are old enough to remember, it was a Tawana Brawley. It was centered around that. A young black girl in New York City said she had been kidnapped and that she had been raped. Turns out later on that it was a lie. And the black community in Harlem went nuts over this, okay? So it's pretty similar in the episode. And the prosecutors, the executive prosecutor was an older white gentleman, and he has, named Ben Stone. He had a younger black protege who was assistant. His name was Paul Robinette. And they come from two different sides. And finally, Ben Stone looks at him and says, hey, Paul, you have to come to a conclusion here. Either you are a black prosecutor or prosecutor is black. Instantaneously, God tapped me on the shoulder and said, Norm, you have to decide what you are. Are you a black Christian or a Christian who just happens to be black? From that moment, everything changed. Everything about me changed, okay? So I began to look at things from a totally different perspective. And some of this it deals directly with this. But before we go to the video, I'm going to tell you that this class is going to provoke some stuff, some thoughts in you. It's meant to do that. It's designed to do that, okay? And anytime anyone has any questions about anything that has to do with race, feel free, come talk to me. There's no down looking, there's no stupid questions. I don't feel there's any racist questions whenever you're asking a question for clarification because you just don't know. How can you know? Okay? Two things I want to say right now in closing is that I will never understand what it means to be a white person in America. You will never understand how it feels to be a black person in America. So until we come to those two conclusions and truths, we'll never get anywhere on this conversation. Good.
There were only two people in the beginning, Adam and Eve. They were both very good and made in the image of God. However, they rebelled and sinned against their Creator. The Bible teaches us that all humanity comes from Adam and Eve, and therefore we are all one race, one blood. Since we are descendants of Adam and Eve, we all are fallen and in need of salvation. God sent Jesus to deliver us from death, sin, and Satan. Through Jesus Christ, sacrificed on the cross, we can be reconciled to God. So we go back to the question. How do we come from? Where do we come from? We were created by God. Why are we here? I'm here to live for Him. I'm here to love Him. Where am I going? I'm going to the consummation when Christ returns. Who am I? In Christ, I'm a child of God, loved, accepted, and able to please Him by the power of His Holy Spirit. God bless you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Bodie Hodge. I've been working at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis for over 15 years now. So I'm kind of like a staple. I've been here for a long time. I'm just getting up there in my age now, it feels like. But I'm going to talk to you today about the subject of the Tower of Babel. And I'm going to look at some of the different fascinating aspects about the Tower of Babel. I'm also going to look at some of the cultural aspects. A lot of these will actually hit home. And so I really hope you guys have a great time with this particular talk. Well, what kind of attacks are there when it comes to the Tower of Babel? There's actually quite a few. For those of you who are familiar with Genesis, Genesis comes under attack quite a bit, especially in today's culture. Whether it's creation, right there at the very beginning, whether it's the flood of Noah's day, we've seen a lot of attacks on that. But do you realize the Tower of Babel also comes under significant attack? Just to give you an idea, some of these attacks, the two that I'm going to hit in this particular talk is where people claim that the Tower of Babel is just mythology. It doesn't make sense of our world. Another aspect is the issue of racism in today's culture. Let's face it, racism is bad, isn't it? I mean, I've been in various parts of the world, and I've seen a lot of forms of racism, and it's a terrible thing. Now, as a Christian, I want to encourage Christians, hey, we should be the ones leading the fight against racism in our culture, and there's good reasons for that. Now, there's a host of other attacks, but I'm not going to go into all the detail of each one of those, but let's face it, there are people who are attacking the Tower of Babel. I hopped on the internet, and I typed in the Tower of Babel. The very first link that came up was Wikipedia. For those of you who are familiar with Wikipedia, Wikipedia changes every day. It's somewhat anti-Christian, but that was the very first link. You go to the very first line, and what do they say? It's an origin myth. Right there, very first thing people would look up. You look up Encyclopedia Britannica online, look at this. They call it a mythological tower in Babylonia. I'm telling you, kids today, people today, all around, researchers, when they look up the Tower of Babel, the first thing they're hit with is, oh, this is just a myth. You can't trust that stuff. That's the kind of stuff that comes from the Bible and Genesis. Well, I'm here to tell you, the Bible can be trusted. It does make sense of the world. And I'm going to dive into this subject. The first thing I really want to dive into, though, is the issue of races and racism in our culture. We hear this term quite a bit. And I've had people say, oh, well, there's all these different races. I've actually spoken in prisons, and I've had people try to tell me that there's a multitude of races. Hey, if we start with the Bible and we all go back to Adam and Eve, how many races of mankind are there? One. We're not used to thinking that way, are we? You see, we've been conditioned by our culture to try to divide people up into a multitude of different races by how they look, whether it's skin tone, whether it's hair, whether it's eye shape. Friends, I want us to step back and start with God and His Word. There's one race, the human race. Acts 17:26. This is Paul speaking, by the way, and he's speaking of God here. And He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwelling. But I love this, from one blood. We are all related. I look out at my audience right now, we're related. Whether you want to be related to me or not, we're related, right? That's right. Amen, brother. You see, we are one blood, but we're in a culture that has conditioned us to look a little different at that. And there's reasons for that. I'm going to dive into that here in a little bit. But see, I've had people say, well, why do people look so different? Why do we see all these different forms of human being? These people, some people have darker skin than I do. Some people have lighter skin. People have darker hair. Some people have hair. God love them. But you see, we have variation, and there's a reason for it. You know, Adam and Eve looked a certain way. And after Adam and Eve, they had descendants, and their descendants did not look exactly like Adam and Eve. Go figure that one out. They have variation within their children. That's expected with their genes. You go all the way up, you have the bottleneck at the flood of Noah's day. Then you have Noah and his family come off the ark. The Lord told them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. What'd they do? They built a city and a tower and said, let's not be scattered. So the Lord confused their language, and different family groups went to different parts of the world, taking a particular gene pool with them, and that's what dominates in that area. It actually makes sense. Now I'm going to look at this in more detail, because the issue of racism is bad. It's terrible. In fact, I hopped on the internet and I said, okay, what kind of racist acts are out there? Boy, you type that in the internet, it's all over the place. There's headlines everywhere. You can see all sorts. There was a killer recently went into Kroger, and that's apparently a racist individual that went in there for that purpose. We see all sorts of different things. I could have put thousands of headlines up here. That's how bad it is just here in the United States. You look across the Western world, we see just as many problems. When I was in Australia, I saw forms of racism. When I was in Sweden, I saw forms of racism. There's a lot. It's all over the place. But let's look back into the past, because we've seen a lot of racist acts back in the past as well. Many of us sitting in this room could probably name specific instances where somebody had been racist to us. And in many cases, there may have been times when we were racist to someone else. Sometimes we may not have even realized it. But consider an individual here named Odabinga. He was from Africa. He was a pygmy. You know what they did to him? They actually put him on display in the zoo, locked him up with the orangutans, put him on display. Hey, look at this guy. He's like an animal. I tell you what, that played on him. Ultimately, Christians saw it and got him released, but he ended up killing himself. What about the Nazis? You go back to Germany, World War II, and even the precursor times leading up to that. They had a breeding program that they called Lebensborn. With Lebensborn, essentially they were trying to breed a master race. They did forced sterilization. Sometimes married people were forced to have children with people that they viewed as being higher on the evolutionary scale. I mean, you got to understand the way the Nazis were thinking. They were thinking in terms of an evolution, millions of years type of a worldview. And with that, they said, okay, Darwin taught that people evolved out of Africa from lower apes. And so apes had darker skin, so they viewed lighter skin as being more evolved. Apes, they said, had a lot of hair, so less hair was more evolved. Apes had dark hair, so maybe blonde hair was more evolved. Apes had dark eyes, so maybe big blue eyes were more evolved. Light complexion things. I always wondered, what were they shooting for? As sad as this is, Beavis and Homer Simpson fit the category. As terrible as that is. But you see, that was the way that they were thinking. They attacked Jews, they attacked Poles, Slavs, Africans. They attacked all sorts of people. But what else did that philosophy lead to? Do you realize that an evolutionary worldview even led to graves being desecrated by Australian Aborigines? There were even instances where they were hunted, and their bodies were put on display in museums around the world. It's terrible to see these types of atrocities. If somebody isn't outraged at these types of things, then there's something wrong with them. These things were terrible atrocities. Now I want to step back and I want to look at this issue. And I want to look at it from a big picture. Big picture here. Either God's right or he's not. Let me ask you, is God right? Yes. God is always right. And when God says that we all go back to Adam and Eve, Adam was the first man, Eve is the mother of all the living, there is one race. But if you reject God and his word, by default, man becomes the authority. And when you reject God, anything goes. Now I want to encourage you to start with the Bible. Let the Bible be the absolute authority at everything you look at, even when it's looking at other people. You see, if we go back to the early pages of the Bible, do you realize man was created supernaturally and unique? We're not like animals, not even close. Genesis 2:7, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Yeah, our bodies are made from dust. That's why it can return to dust once we sinned. But you see, God made our bodies, but where did the life come from? It came from God. God breathed life into us. You see, we as mankind, we are made in the image of God. Then the woman was made from the rib, from the side, from Adam. Genesis 2:22, then the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. See, man and woman, we are both made in the image of God. We were both made supernaturally and unique. Hey, is this too hard for an all-powerful God to do this? No, this is all too easy. I've had people say, well, Eve should have been a clone if she came from Adam. No, this is God we're talking about. This isn't a problem, okay? But I've had people say, but Bodie, we're in a culture, look around. We see all these people who are red and yellow and black and white. Why are we conditioned to look at that? I've had people come up to me and say, hey, Bodie, you're a white person. No. I don't know if you guys have seen anything that's white. Here, let me show you something that's white. We got all sorts of things that are white, and I don't know if you can see this up here. I'm going to try to pull it off so you can see it just a little bit better. And I'll show you what white looks like. Ready? Ready? Well, almost ready. Almost ready. Technology, I'm telling you. This is white. Now I'm going to put this up to my skin. You tell me, am I white? Am I even close to that color? No, I'm not. If I look like that, call a Hearst. Ambulance isn't going to help. It's all over with. No, I'm kind of brownish. In fact, we're all kind of brownish. Some are more brown, some are less brown. It's not a big deal. When you start with Scripture, it makes sense of that. You see, we see this variation in different people. That's not a big deal. God loves that variety. But you see, when you reject God and his word, people start looking at this variety from an entirely different viewpoint. So why do some people look darker? Why do some people look lighter? Why do we see variations in people? It actually goes back to our DNA. DNA does not stand for the National Dyslexia Association. Yeah, some of you guys got that right off the bat. Come on, we got to have a little fun with this. It's a tough subject. We can still have some fun with it. Deoxyribonucleic acid. It's actually a fascinating code system that codes for the way our whole bodies are built. It's got an incredible amount of information in it. So much information in the human genome. Our DNA is made up of about 3 billion base pairs. Now, what that equates to, if you count this as information, about 1,000 books of 500 pages of information. That's an incredible amount of information. I love looking at this kind of stuff. But what our DNA codes for are things like skin shape, eye color, hair amount, hair color. I got the genetics that causes my hair to fall out on my head. It starts to grow on my back. I don't get that one. But apparently I've got the genetics for that. But let's just get an idea of how much information is contained in that genome. If any two people, male and female, had a child, how many different children can they have that won't be identical by getting information from mom and dad? Not necessarily identical twins or triplets where it's the same DNA that splits. You know how many it would be? 10 to the power 2017. You can't even imagine that number. This is a 10 with 2017 zeros after. It's tough to even imagine that. Now, let me give you a comparison. The estimated number of atoms in the entire known universe is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to the power 80th. I'll tell you what, that gives you a taste of the mind of God, doesn't it, when he created mankind. But you see, we see variations in people, and that's not a big deal. That's a lovely thing. That's a lovely thing. But you know, if we look at, say, animals, we see variation in animals too, don't we? We see variation in plants and a lot of different things. Do you realize when God created things in Genesis chapter 1, he said he created them after their kind or according to their kind? Let me ask you, do animals change? Yeah, they change. Like you guys like dogs? Yeah, you guys like dogs, that's right. Do you guys like cats? Not so much. Okay, we're going to stick with the dogs in this example. I mean, we see a variation of dogs up here on our screen. If you start at the far left, you got this wolf-like creature. That's a pretty dog. That's a shaggy dog, that third one. The next one in, that's an ugly dog. That's a cute dog. That's a really ugly dog. And, well, that's a dog. It looks like a rat, but it's a dog. But you see, these are all dogs. These are just variations in these dogs, right? Do you realize that all these dogs can ultimately interbreed with each other? They're part of the one dog kind. That's what we like to say. Here's a number of different domesticated dogs. We got a variety of those, more domesticated dogs. All the domestic dogs are actually classed as one species, and yet we'll look at the variation we see just in those. So how is it that we get all this variation within dogs all around the world? Let's think about this. Let's go back into the past. Noah comes off the ark, and he has 2 of each kind on board the ark, right? Of the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. He has 2 dogs on board the ark. These 2 dogs come off the ark, and they fall in love and get married. Now, I'm going to teach you some genetics. Now, don't let me scare you with this. It's actually a lot more complicated than this, but let me explain it like this. Let's say these 2 dogs have medium-length fur. And let's say that they have the genes for long hair and short hair in there, and let's say that when those 2 are together, that expresses medium-length fur. Now, like I said, it is more complicated than this. But let's say they get married and they have babies. What kind of babies can they have? Well, they can actually have babies have short hair fur because they get the short hair gene from mom and the short hair gene from dad. Or they can have others with medium-length fur where they get a long hair and a short hair from either mom or dad. They can even have babies that have all long hair because they get a long hair gene from mom and a long hair gene from dad. So all of a sudden in one generation, you can have dogs with long hair, medium length fur, or short hair, all right there in one generation. Now, these dogs come off the ark, and you know, if you know anything about dogs, dogs have more dogs. And dogs have more dogs, and they have more dogs. If you know anything about dogs, you end up with lots of dogs. Not to be confused with hot dogs. You can eat hot dogs. I don't know if you want to eat hot dogs, because if you know what's in a hot dog, you may not want to eat that. But either way, you're going to get lots of dogs. And dogs like to eat hot dogs too, just so you know. Whew. Good thing I don't have to say that twice. But you end up with lots of dogs. Now, dogs start to go to different parts of the world. Now, some parts of the world get hot. Some parts of the world get cold. You go up north, it gets cold up north. Okay, so the dogs that go up north, it gets cold up there. So do you think the dogs with short fur like that? No, they don't like that. In fact, what ends up happening, let's say you get some dogs go up to the far north, the dogs that like that are the dogs with the long fur. They can survive in that real easy. The dogs with short fur or medium-length fur, they're either going to move away or die off. So you're only going to be left with a population of dogs with long-haired fur up north. Okay? Same sort of thing if the dogs go to a place that becomes a Sahara Desert. It starts to get hot. The dogs with shorter fur, they actually prefer that. The dogs with long hair fur, they don't like that. They're going to move away or die off. So you're going to be left with a population of dogs that only have short fur. See how you get the variation as animals go to various parts of the world. It's actually not that big of a deal. We see variations. But I want you to notice these dogs don't change into cats. They don't change into elephants or dinosaurs. They don't change into anything. These are dogs, and you see a variation in the dogs. Dingoes, for example, have lost the information for long hair. Collies here have lost the information for short hair, but they're still all dogs. Chihuahuas lost a lot of information. Those poor things. They're so ugly, people put clothes on them in Hollywood. Just picking on the Chihuahuas here. But I want you to notice, these types of variations are not evolutionary changes. Okay? These are just dogs changing into dogs. You see, in an evolutionary worldview, let's just go back. In an evolutionary worldview, if you start with some sort of single-celled organism like an amoeba, and it's going to evolve all the way up into a dog up here, you're going to have to add new information to its genome. You need to add information for hair. You need to add information for a brain, add information for a circulatory system and a nervous system and so forth. Those are not the changes we observe. What we observe are variations within the dogs. Dogs changing into dogs. That's what we call a horizontal variation, not a vertical variation. We see this of other creatures, not just dogs. We see variations in chickens. And even these are some of the domestic chickens. Some of these are really, I've seen some of these real Transylvanian naked neck chickens. They are ugly. Oh, ugly looking chickens. But you know, some of these chickens can actually interbreed with things like pheasants and with turkeys and things. They're all part of that fowl kind. So you see variations in this sort of thing. Same sort of thing with horses. Here's a number of our domesticated horses, but they can actually breed with things like donkeys and with things like zebras and so forth. You see variation within this horse kind. It's not a big deal. So when we look at people, we need to think along the same lines. Same but different. You see, when it came to the dogs, the environment affected them. When they went to a cold place, it affected them. Humans are a little different. We defy the natural elements, don't we? It gets cold, what do? Put clothes on. Build a fire, build a house. You see, we can defy that sort of thing. But people still get divvied up to different parts of the world according to the Tower of Babel, and that explains that a little bit more. But you know, I've heard people say, but what about the skin tones themselves? Red and yellow and black and white. Doesn't that remind you of a little kid's song? Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Do you realize there's kids around the world singing that a little different? They're singing shades of brown from dark to light, they are precious in his sight. Do you realize that's actually more accurate? And here's why. Let me explain this. You know, there's a pigment in our skin. There's actually a couple, but one of the main ones is one called melanin. It's a brownish pigment that appears in your skin. And if your genes say produce more of this, you're going to be darker on the scale. If your genes say produce a little bit less of it, you're going to be lighter on the scale. Now, this image actually came from National Geographic. They lined up a bunch of girls in a classroom just to show you it's one color. It's just how much is there. Do you have more of this melanin color? Do you have less of this? See, we're not usually taught to look at things like this. I think this was brilliant research that they did, just lining these guys up. You see, I probably sit somewhere in here. And then after summer, I'm somewhere in here. I move over a little bit. You know how sun affects that too. But you see, this goes back to our genetics. Now, I'm going to put a little bit more genetics out there. Of course, it's even more complicated than this too. But let's say that we have two parents up here that have capital A, capital B, small b. Now, I'm throwing some big stuff out here. Let's say the capital A and the capital B stand for produce lots of melanin. Let's say the small a and the small b say, well, let's produce smaller amounts of melanin. So let's say, how many different children can they have? Well, you can have children who are really dark where they get the capital A's and the capital B's from both mom and dad, or children who are really light, small a, small b down here on the lower right, to produce very little bits of melanin. You can see the variation all the way through here. Now, it's even more complicated than this, of course. But look, notice, you can get people who are really dark to really light in one generation. I've had people say, no, that takes thousands of years. You've got to be kidding me. Not at all. Oh, yeah, it can happen. It really can happen. I want you to take a look at these Horder twins. Just absolutely beautiful. Here they are as children. Here they are kind of grown up a little bit more. But both of these parents had a light and a dark parent. And so they actually came out kind of middle brown. And look at those beautiful twins. Dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin. It's twins right there. You know what? We see a lot of examples of this. Here's a couple of girls, Grant twins. They had a father who was Jamaican and their mother was English. Here's another set, mixed doubles. Another set. Here, the mother was a mix between English and Nigerian, and the father was English. Look at those little twins. Ryan and Leo, look at those cute little kids. A German father and a African mother from Ghana. Oh, I love this one. Twin Credibles. 2 sets of two-tone twins. How cool is that, right? Absolutely beautiful. Oh, I just love seeing things like this. But notice, this is just a variation in your genetics. Produce more melanin, produce less melanin. Hey, it's something very similar with your eye color, too. More melanin versus less melanin. Of course, you can get variations all throughout there. And I'm blown away by this kind of stuff. But you see, if you go back to the genetics, we have variations even in our eye shape because of our genetics. You know, we can look at piece after piece of humans and why we look a little bit different, but it goes back to our genetic makeup. That's what it is. Biologically, I want you to understand, biologically, there is one race, the human race. That's what it is. Well, why is racism so prevalent in our culture today? I mean, if people were starting with the Bible, saying, hey, we all go back to Adam and Eve, we're all related, should there be racism? Nope. In fact, when we get to heaven, there isn't going to be any racism. Amen, right? That's something to look forward to. But we're not in heaven. Instead, we're in a sin-cursed and broken world where a lot of false ideas become popular. Consider this one. The evolution of man. We've been drilled with this one. I've been drilled with this left and right. Tell me if you've ever heard this story. Man evolved out of Africa from a lower ape. Man was not very smart, kind of like a dumb brute. Finally, we got smart enough that we could actually start planting our own crops instead of being a hunter and gatherer. Finally, you get smart enough to start producing real good crops, and then you get smart enough to say, you know what, let's just stay here and build our own shelter. It's kind of rudimentary at first. Finally, you get smart enough, you could build fancier houses, or at least fancier shelters. Then you get to a point where you can develop your own civilizations, like Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, or Egypt, places like that. I heard that over and over again. Do you know what? Ancient historians don't mention anything of the sort. We don't see that from ancient historians. That is a brand new, rewritten history that has been imposed upon generations of people. Darwin was the first one to propose that man evolved out of Africa. He proposed that in his book, The Descent of Man, because that's where you find the apes, and he believed we evolved from apes. Totally in contrary to what God says in his word. This philosophy goes all the way back to an alleged Big Bang. Essentially, there was nothing, no time, no space, nothing at all. Something pops into existence from nothing, rapidly explodes or expands. They claim that happened anywhere from about 13 to 15 billion years ago. And then you have the evolution of the universe. Finally, we get the first life in here, where you have what's called chemical evolution, where chemicals come together and form the first life, and it evolves further and further to where you finally get people. And you know what they taught? A lot of these early evolutionists, they taught, well, some people are more evolved than others. This is what Darwin taught. And they had a multitude of races, but usually what a lot of these early evolutionists had was 4 different races. Now, I'll be honest, I don't like these terms, I don't like saying it, but this is what they had. They had the Caucasoid, or the Caucasian, the Mongoloid, the Negroid, and the Australoid. And they actually went so far as to rank them. They put the Caucasians on top, and they put the Australian Aborigines at the bottom. Can you see why their graves were desecrated and they were hunted? Because people were looking at them as though they were some sort of missing link. Oh, I hate this type of terminology. In fact, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to just get rid of the term races. Just throw it in the trash. Toss it out. Let it be gone. Because we have different people groups, different family groups in various parts of the world. Nevertheless, a lot of these early evolutionists, they were really teaching that there were higher and lower races. One of the early evolutionists, he was a German man named Ernst Haeckel. He wrote a book called The History of Creation, popularized an evolutionary worldview to the German people, which ultimately led to Nazism. There's a big connection in there. But look what he says here. He says, at the lowest stage of human mental development are the Australians, some tribes of the Polynesians, and the Bushmen, the Hottentots, and some of the Negro tribes. Let me ask you, would something like that fuel racism? Yes, it would. Where did he get this idea? He got it from Charles Darwin himself in his book, The Descent of Man. Charles Darwin says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphic apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will then intervene between man and a more civilized stage, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla. You know what Darwin's saying here? The Caucasians are on top and they should wipe out everyone else. Sadly, the Nazis tried to do that sort of thing, and there's other people still trying to promote these types of terrible ideas. But you can see why the Australian Aborigines were hunted. Their graves were desecrated and all sorts of terrible atrocities occurred with them. Now, I want you to understand something. I want to throw a caveat out there. Evolution is not the cause of racism. Racism was around long before that. But once people started to buy into an evolutionary worldview, it just exploded because it was inherently a racist philosophy. Stephen Jay Gould, he was a former professor at Harvard University, he died a few years back. He says, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. You see, they actually fit very well together. I've had people say, but Bodie, aren't there all these missing links that prove evolution? No, not at all. Let me explain that for just a moment. Let me drop into that. There's 3 ways people try to make a missing link. 3. 1, you take bones of a human, you take bones of an ape, and you try to build a missing link. But is that even a real creature? No, because you got bones of human and bones of ape. That's not even a real creature. You're just trying to, make a Lego building of some sort, with those bones. The second way to try to make a missing link is you take an ape and you try to make it look like a human. And we see instances of that. Lucy, for example, Australopithecine afarensis, that's just an ape, a variant form of chimpanzee. And what do? They try to make it look as human-like as possible, make it stand up in museums, almost as tall as me, give it human hands and feet and human eyes and things like that. They're taking an ape, trying to make it look like a human. And of course, the third way to make a missing link is you take a human and you try to make it look like an ape. That's a great case of Neanderthal. Neanderthal's a human. Wore clothes. They made musical instruments. They worshipped. They were clearly human. All the features of a Neanderthal are within the human population even today. But what do you see in a lot of the artist illustrations is they take this human, they try to put ape-like features on it. Now, there's a lot of defunct missing links and things like that floating around out there. Here's just a handful that may pop up in the news. And I know some of these may be difficult for you to read. But Neanderthal's right up here at the top. What is it? We just break it down. It's a human. What you're typically finding are humans and apes. In some cases you find some extinct apes and whatnot. Sometimes you have a junk category where they take some of the human bones and some of the ape bones and put it together. In some cases, they're so desperate to find missing links, like Ida down here, it's a lemur. I'm telling you, people really want their missing links. But we just need to step back and realize there's one race, the human race. And when it comes to missing links, there's a reason they're called missing links, because they're missing. They're not there. Well, friends, I want to encourage you, if you want to find out more about the subject of racism, particularly in our culture, some of the scientific problems with it, this is an incredible book, One Race, One Blood. It's by Ken Ham, the founder of the Ministry of Answers in Genesis. He's the CEO of the ministry. And Dr. Charles Ware. He's an African-American who actually is a president of Crossroads Bible College. And, he deals with a lot of the cultural issues of this powerful book. And I want to encourage you to consider that one.
All right. So we see a lot of things in this particular part of the video. Basically, what he's getting at, if I can boil it all down, he's saying that there's 2 theories, okay? One, the Bible, which is God's perfect word. The second is evolution. That's man's fallible opinion. So we have 2 options here. Either God was right or he's not. So that's a interesting opposites, I like to call it. Ben, you're a science teacher, right? Yep. And what makes Ben an expert in science, that he's a graduate of Geneva College. So could you imagine if you went to your science class and start teaching some of this stuff? You probably wouldn't have a job very long, would you?
It'd be controversial.
We run with that, controversial. All right, so the way that I kind of look at things, especially when I talk to people who have a difference of opinion. And these days, whether it's on social media or not so much out in the public on this subject, they fall on the opposite side of racism. By the way, I hate the term African American. I hate it. I'm a black man. It assumes that everyone from Africa is black. Teresa Hines Carey, she's an African American. Ernie Els, he's an African American. And a whole lot of other people of the lighter hue from Africa. So I hate that term. And it automatically assumes any person of a darker skin shade, even though they might be from Haiti or whatever, that they're from Africa. I hate the term. But anyway, that's the political correctness, and I can't stand political correctness. I have a good definition of that, by the way. I have to tell you about that later, about political correctness. So what we're looking at is that so when I find people who have racist thoughts and views, I kind of stump them a little bit. And I did this once. We were in a strip district in the kitchenware store. I can't remember the name of that place, the balcony or whatever, next to Woolies. And I do this sometimes, and my wife just puts her head down and does it's like, oh. And so I've been doing it for so long. We've been married for 20 years, together for 22 and a half years. She's kind of used to it now. But I kind of look at them and I said, so are you a Christian? And if they say no, I'll hit them with one thing. And if they say yes, I'll hit them with something different. So if they tell me that they're a Christian, I said, so you believe in creation? Well, yeah, of course. You believe in Adam and Eve, right? God made Adam, then he made Eve out of rib from Adam. Yes, that's right. So we're all the same then, because we came from one place. And they sort of scratch their heads, and usually they mumble as they walk away. People who are from the other side, and I said, so you believe in evolution, Darwin, HMS Beagle, and all that rat nonsense? And they, oh yeah, that's right, we all evolved. Oh, so we all evolved from apes then, right? Single-cell organism. Yeah, that's right, that's the only way. Oh, so we're all the same then. And then they scratch their head and mumble and walk away. Probably have a few choice words for me. But what I'm getting at is that no matter what you believe, if you believe in creation, which is correct, or you believe in evolution, which is highly incorrect, we still all came from the same place. So how can you believe that I'm any different than anyone else? How could I be any different from Tom? We have the same number of bones, teeth, everything else. I just have a better tan than Tom. Mine's natural. He has to work a little harder.
Have to work very hard.
Exactly. Well, unless you're like my lovely wife, she just doesn't tan at all. It's that good Irish breeding. So no matter where you fall on this side, which other side you are, whether you're Christian or not, we're still all the same. We're one race. We are one blood. It's just that simple. There's no other way that you can put it. Any questions on anything that we've seen? We're looking, yeah, we have a couple of minutes. Wait, I can't see back there. Do I have a choice?
I wanted to add a little bit about that person, Stephen Jay Gould, that was mentioned there, who said that racism existed before 1850, but increased exponentially after Darwin's theory came out. He was an ardent evolutionist. He was the most popular evolutionist during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was a professor of paleontology at Harvard. Wrote many books, and I have one of them here called Ever Since Darwin. I have several of his books. He writes in a very nice style, but I always, he was also very anti-creationist, but I always admired him because he was an honest evolutionist who would say things like that racism increased exponentially after Darwin. He also said things like the secret of paleontology is that the fossil record does not support the Darwin theory. And he was a paleontologist. Under the Darwin theory, the fossil record should show gradual changes of all of the fossils, and in fact it shows
the opposite.
And then a big period of no change, and then fossils and a big period of no change. That didn't cause him to be a creationist. He came up with the idea called punctuated equilibrium, where evolution just happened real fast in spurts. So the Darwinists said it was happening too slowly, we couldn't see it. He came up with the idea it would happen too fast, that we couldn't see it. The other thing that he did, though, he had a student at Harvard who was an avowed creationist, and he sponsored him and allowed him to get his PhD at Harvard in geology, which is something that probably would not happen today. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Ota Benga. Ota Benga, the pygmy who was in the Bronx Zoo for, they were starting around 1906. there were Christians, particularly black Christians, churches and pastors who objected to that. But the scientific community, the top people in science, said no, this was science. And in fact, the New York Times,
A former newspaper.
we do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter of Otabenga. Pygmies were very low in the human scale, and whether they are really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes, they are of equal interest in the student of ethnology and can be studied with profit. And then they had this haughty statement about the African American or black pastors. They said that the reverend colored brethren should be told that evolution is, in one form or another, is now taught in the textbooks of all the schools, that it is no more debatable than the multiplication table. And the suggestion that Benga should be placed in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place of torture to him, and one from which he could draw no advantage whatever. So, science isn't always right.
So we shouldn't follow the science?
And there it is. Thanks, Bob. I think that slide's coming up on the next video, if memory serves me. So, any other questions? In closing, a couple of outside interests. If you ever want to read up on racial reconciliation, my time in the seminary, without a doubt, it's Dr. John M. Perkins. So it's John M. Perkins, not John Perkins, the economist. He has a very interesting story, to put a little mildly and short. He was a black man who grew up in Mississippi, the Deep South, during the Civil Rights era, well, previous to the Civil Rights era. And he was beaten and left for dead, kind of like the movie Mississippi Burning, only he didn't die. And somehow he survived. But as a Christian man, he always believed that you should not hate those that try to break or oppress you. Interesting perspective. And he went on to start, it's called the Voices of Calvary in Jackson, Mississippi, Mendenhall Project. So if you ever want to read, he's written so many books. Dr. Perkins is still with us. I think he's 92 now. But awesome man who talks about racial reconciliation. And he takes a different approach than most people or men of God of the darker hue. He talks about true reconciliation. We'll talk more about that later. And then if you ever want to see some good sermons on racial reconciliation, it's Dr. Bob, I can't remember his first name now. Voddie.
That's his first name.
Voddie Baucham. Yeah, Dr. Voddie Baucham. He's another man of a darker hue who had similar experience to me, but his was a little later, and as a pastor, very interesting. So he has some great sermons on that too. So you can, if you want, you can shoot me an email and I can send you the information on the books and some of his sermons. All right, so next week we'll pick up with the, Bill?
Yeah, I just got a comment. I think the evolutionists at some point realized that vertical evolution, like in the chart, can't happen. So they, in order to justify their position, they had to go with billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
If you understand evolution and how people and animals recreate, procreate, genetics cannot allow, it's a mathematical improbability that a frog could turn into a squirrel.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need male and female to develop or ever evolve at the same time with eyes and organ systems. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So each species has to be created by God individually. Now the variations occur depending on climate and that sort of thing, as we saw this morning.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think the creationist has more science behind it if you really dig into the science than the other.
And Bill is an expert on science. He went to medical school as a dentist, and he's also a Geneva College grad. So you see a theme here. I'm tired of these Grove City people, man, running this place. Yeah, so we'll pick up next week. So if we can close in prayer.